By the spring of 1945, the village of Kadena on the island of Okinawa had become a place of quiet dread. Every day unfolded with mechanical stillness, mornings that began in silence, afternoons heavy with unease, and nights suffocated by absolute darkness. People no longer spoke freely, for fear that even words might betray them. The shadows had grown longer, not just from the war, but from the deepening weight of suspicion and indoctrination. The idea of survival had quietly been replaced with the expectation of sacrifice. For years, Japanese civilians had been told that American soldiers were not human. Posters depicted them with distorted faces and claws. School teachers warned children that the enemy drank blood and mutilated captives, and radios buzzed with tales of unimaginable cruelty. The narrative was relentless. Surrender was not an option, and capture was worse than death. From temples to classrooms, the message was clear. If the Americans came, it was better to die than be taken alive. In homes across Kadena, this belief manifested in terrifying rituals. Mothers sharpened kitchen knives not to fight, but to take their children's lives before the enemy could. Local authorities distributed cyanide pills and grenades with instructional pamphlets. These weren't gestures of paranoia, they were official policy, backed by whispers of what happened to those who hesitated. Rumors of entire families committing suicide in neighboring villages became cautionary tales with moral approval. Children absorbed these messages without question. At school, they memorized songs that glorified self-destruction, praising those who leapt off cliffs with honor. Boys were taught to stab themselves in the gut if cornered. Girls were shown images of heroines slitting their throats rather than surrendering. The emperor was not just a figurehead, he was a god, and dying for him was the only noble end. Even playtime had turned into rehearsals for martyrdom. Fathers, too old to fight on the front, prepared the home front like a battlefield. Some dug escape tunnels that led nowhere. Others fashioned makeshift traps near entrances. Grandparents whispered instructions into the ears of grandchildren about what to do when the monsters arrive. These weren't strategies for resistance, they were blueprints for annihilation. Death had become not just accepted, but rehearsed. Each evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, the village descended into a blackout. Lanterns remained cold, shutters sealed, and voices fell to whispers. Families slept huddled in basements dug by hand, breathing shallowly, afraid that even the sound of living might draw attention. The thud of distant artillery had become a lullaby of sorts, terrifying but expected, a reminder that the end was always near. Fields were left untended, tools rusting in their sheds. Farmers no longer plowed or sowed. They had accepted that there would be no harvest. The land, like its people, had been abandoned to waiting. Children, once full of mischief, no longer ran or played. Their innocence had been buried beneath air raid drills, blackout rehearsals, and stories of the honor of dying in flames. And yet, beneath all this fear, something fragile persisted. A mother's hand still reached instinctively for her child in the dark. A father still muttered a prayer, even if he no longer believed it would be answered. But these gestures were private, almost guilty acts, small rebellions against the tidal wave of fatalism. Hope, if it existed at all, had no voice. So when word arrived that American troops had landed on Okinawa and were moving north, the village responded not with chaos, but with silence. A silence that wasn't calm, but final. The kind that comes when people have already said goodbye in their hearts. The people of Kadena didn't run. They didn't scream. They simply waited. For the fire, for the end, for the fulfillment of the horror they had been taught to expect. The morning of May 5th began with an oppressive stillness that felt heavier than usual. Tomoko Ishikawa, a 32-year-old widow, moved quietly through the remains of her home, preparing a small pot of rice for herself and her son, Riku. Her hands worked on instinct, her eyes fixed on the floor, her ears attuned to the slightest sound beyond the thin wooden walls. Outside, the world held its breath, waiting. She did not yet know that this would be the moment everything unraveled. Without warning, the sky erupted. An artillery shell struck nearby, shaking the earth with violent force. The windows burst inward, shattering glass across the room. Dust rose in clouds, and the ceiling groaned. Tomoko barely had time to call Riku's name before another explosion roared closer. She threw herself over her son just as the support beams above them gave way. The house collapsed with a crash that drowned out her scream. A massive timber slammed into the floor, narrowly missing her body, but trapping Riku's leg beneath its crushing weight. Tomoko's arms trembled as she shielded him from falling debris. Her breath came in ragged bursts, and the air filled with ash, wood splinters, and the acrid smell of smoke. She could hear nothing but the ringing in her ears. Riku whimpered, his voice cracked with fear and pain. His small fingers clutched at her sleeve, and she could feel the warmth of blood soaking through his trousers. She tried to lift the beam with both hands, bracing herself against the broken floorboards. It didn't budge. Her fingers slipped, raw from the effort, and she began to panic. There was no one else, no help, no escape. Outside, the village was descending into chaos. More shells exploded in the distance, and the screams of neighbors echoed faintly through the gaps in the crumbled walls. Somewhere, a dog barked wildly, then went silent. The air grew thicker with every breath. Tomoko's eyes stung as she scanned the wreckage, calculating whether the rest of the house would fall. Every second felt like a countdown to entombment. But even as her instincts screamed to run, to save herself, she couldn't move. Riku was trapped, and she would not leave him. She pressed her forehead against his, whispering words she could barely form. Her heart raced, her body trembled, but her resolve held firm. She would not abandon her child, no matter what the war demanded of her. Then, through the suffocating dust and muffled destruction, she heard something strange. Voices. Not sharp commands or angry shouting, but something softer, unfamiliar. Foreign words, English, reached her ears like a dream. Her blood ran cold. The Americans, the monsters they had all been taught to fear. She instinctively clamped her hand over Riku's mouth. One of the voices called out again, this time in halting Japanese. The words were simple, hesitant, but unmistakable. "Is anyone alive? We help! We help!" Tomoko's mind reeled. It didn't make sense. They weren't supposed to say things like that. They weren't supposed to ask. They were supposed to destroy. Her body froze in indecision. But Riku was bleeding. He was trapped, sobbing, his little body trembling beneath hers. She looked down at him, then up at the shifting debris above. Another blast could finish them both. Her heart pounded as she made a choice. Against everything she had been taught, she opened her mouth and screamed for help, just once, loud enough to be heard. Moments later, the rubble shifted. A shadow emerged through the haze, crouching low. A young man in green, face smeared with dirt, eyes wide with urgency. He looked at her, then at the boy. He raised his hand slowly, carefully. Tomoko didn't move. She couldn't. She just stared, her breath caught in her throat, as the soldier dropped to one knee beside them and reached for the beam. And in that instant, the foundations of her world began to crack. Sergeant Michael Henley had never expected war to feel this personal. In training, he had been taught triage, evacuation protocol, and how to prioritize casualties on the battlefield. But nothing had prepared him for the raw human moments that existed between bombs. As a medic, he had taken an oath to save lives, regardless of uniforms. That morning, when he heard the faint cry in Japanese beneath the sound of crumbling wood and distant fire, he didn't hesitate. He shouted a warning to his commanding officer and sprinted toward the ruined structure without waiting for permission. The building had been gutted by the blast, its frame twisted, roof collapsed. Dust hung in the air like fog. Henley coughed as he ducked low, stepping over shattered planks, calling out with the few Japanese words he had memorized. When a woman's voice responded, broken and desperate, he followed the sound into the wreckage. Inside, it was darker than he expected. A woman crouched protectively over a small boy, her face streaked with soot and terror. The child's leg was pinned beneath a thick support beam, his foot twisted at an unnatural angle. Henley dropped to one knee, nodded to the mother, and pressed his shoulder against the beam. It resisted at first. The weight of the structure bore down on him like a wall. Still, he didn't stop. With a grunt, he shifted his footing and pushed again. Inch by inch, the beam lifted just enough. The mother reacted instantly, pulling her son's leg free with trembling hands. The boy screamed in pain, but Henley didn't flinch. He knelt beside him and checked his pulse, his breathing, the swelling in his leg. The language barrier didn't matter. His hands knew what to do. Gunfire cracked outside, closer now. Henley glanced toward the doorless frame of what was once a wall. His time was running out. They were exposed, vulnerable, and dangerously close to the fighting. He wrapped the boy in his arms and stood up, motioning urgently for the woman to follow. Her eyes darted between the soldier and her child. Then she obeyed, stumbling after him. As they stepped into the open, the soundscape changed. Bullets snapped through the air, ricocheting off stone and metal. Dirt kicked up at Henley's boots as he ran, each footfall a prayer. He bent forward, shielding the boy's head with his body, heart pounding in his ears. The mother followed close behind, barefoot and wild-eyed, her breath ragged with fear and exhaustion. Then it happened. A sudden, sharp crack tore through the chaos. Henley staggered mid-step, his leg buckling beneath him. The child cried out as they fell together into the dirt. Blood spread across Henley's upper back like a slow-moving tide. The bullet had pierced near his shoulder blade, friendly fire in the madness of the moment. Still, he clung to the boy, refusing to let go. Private Lawson, a young soldier in Henley's unit, saw him fall and rushed forward. Two more followed, dodging incoming fire to reach the trio. They lifted the boy from Henley's arms and helped the mother to her feet. Lawson knelt beside his fellow medic, eyes wide with shock, whispering that the child was safe. Henley managed a faint smile. His fingers twitched once, then fell still. Unbeknownst to the soldiers, dozens of villagers had witnessed everything from behind cracked walls and fallen fences. They had seen an American rush into danger for a Japanese child. They had seen him wounded, not in rage or vengeance, but in the act of protection. And in that moment, something deep inside them shifted. The figure they feared most had bled for them, had fallen for them, and the story they thought they knew began to unravel. After Sergeant Henley collapsed, the world around him did not erupt in panic. It fell into a hush. The boy he had carried still clung to his shirt, his small fingers curled into the blood-soaked fabric. Tomoko knelt beside him, her eyes wide and unblinking, unsure whether to touch him or flee. Her hands hovered over his chest, shaking with uncertainty. It was the first time she had ever been this close to an American, and nothing she saw matched what she had been told. Around them, the chaos of battle softened, though the threat remained in the distance. Soldiers moved quickly, communicating in sharp bursts, but no one shouted in anger or triumph. Instead, there was urgency. When one of them gently pried the child from Henley's arms and handed him to another medic, the soldier whispered something soothing, even if no one could understand it. The gesture alone carried meaning. Villagers watched from behind the safety of half-collapsed walls and shattered gates. Eyes that had expected monsters instead saw a man lying in the dirt, broken not by rage but by choice. He had run into danger not for conquest but to save a child. No one had ever told them this was possible. It was like seeing the moon fall out of the sky or water burn. Every certainty they held had cracked. Whispers began to spread through the alleyways and bunkers. Some claimed it was a trick, a performance for sympathy. Others said the soldier hadn't known the boy was Japanese. But Tomoko, still covered in dust and blood, contradicted them. She described how he had looked at her son, how he had held him, how his face twisted in pain only after the boy was safe. Her voice was quiet but insistent. She had seen his eyes, and they weren't filled with hate. When American medics arrived to stabilize Henley, the villagers did not scatter. They stayed, silent and motionless, drawn forward by something they didn't understand. One of the elders, a man who had buried 2 sons to the war, stepped forward without speaking. He removed a small handkerchief from his robe and placed it gently over Henley's chest. The gesture was one of reverence, reserved for those who died with honor. The Americans didn't stop him. Later that afternoon, as the light shifted and the heat gave way to shadow, an interpreter gathered the villagers near what remained of the town square. He explained in careful Japanese that Henley had acted alone. No order had been given. No reward awaited him. He had simply heard a voice and responded. The interpreter's voice cracked midway, unable to hide the weight of what he was translating. Some villagers began to cry, not out of fear, but out of shame. They had believed in demons. They had been prepared to murder their own children rather than face people like this man. And now, standing in the wake of his sacrifice, they didn't know what to believe. Something within them had shifted, not dramatically, but deeply. The stories they had memorized began to lose their grip. That night, no one prepared knives. No one mixed poison into bowls of rice. Instead, doors were left slightly open, and families sat closer together, not from fear, but from the need to feel human again. Tomoko stayed awake long after Riku fell asleep, staring at the ceiling of a borrowed room. She thought about the young man who had entered her life only long enough to nearly lose his own. She did not know his name, but she knew what he had undone. Sergeant Henley had not spoken their language, had not worn a smile, had not preached or pleaded. But with one act, he had broken a wall built over generations. And now, on the other side of that broken wall, the people of Kadena began to see what had been hidden from them all along, not a nation of monsters, but a glimpse of something painfully, beautifully human. The sun rose gently over Kadena the following morning, casting long golden rays across scorched rooftops and blackened soil. But this dawn felt different. The air, once thick with dread, now carried a strange calm. Villagers emerged from their hiding places, slowly, cautiously, their bodies stiff from nights spent in basements and tunnels. Instead of listening for shell fire, they listened to the silence and found it unfamiliar. Word of the injured American medic had traveled through the village like wind through dry grass. Children who had once hidden behind their mothers now asked quiet questions. Was the soldier alive? Why had he helped? The adults had no easy answers. Instead, they watched the road, waiting to see if what they had witnessed was an exception or the beginning of something new. Later that morning, the Americans returned. But they did not come with guns raised or helmets lowered. They came with bandages, clean water, and boxes of food. A translator stepped forward, explaining that they were here not to conquer, but to offer help. The villagers did not believe him, not at first, but they didn't retreat either. They stood in place, uncertain, and watched. Tomoko was the first to move. With Riku limping beside her, his leg wrapped in a makeshift bandage, she stepped forward and bowed. Her voice trembled as she asked about the medic. The translator responded gently. Sergeant Henley was alive, but his condition remained serious. He had been evacuated to a field hospital, and doctors were doing everything they could. Tomoko bowed again, this time deeper, her eyes brimming with something too complex to name. That moment seemed to unlock something. One by one, others joined her. They pointed to collapsed wells, led soldiers to wounded neighbors, and shared what little food they had. Where fear once dictated every action, cooperation began to take root. Children accepted rations from American hands. An elderly woman tied a torn sash around a soldier's wrist in thanks. Nothing grand was said, but everything changed. By late afternoon, American engineers worked alongside villagers to clear debris from the main road. A young soldier handed a boy a folded paper crane carefully crafted from a food wrapper. The boy smiled shyly and tucked it into his shirt. Nearby, another soldier crouched beside a girl drawing patterns in the dirt, handing her his notepad to sketch more. The language gap remained, but it no longer mattered. As evening fell, a small gathering formed near the remains of the schoolyard. There were no formal speeches, no flags, no orders, just quiet acknowledgement. One American soldier lit a stick of incense and placed it beside a stone near a tree. A local monk, head bowed, stepped forward to do the same. The wind carried the scent of the smoke across the village, soft and bittersweet, like breath returning to a body long starved of air. That night, the village sounded different. There was no gunfire, no weeping, no whispered rehearsals of death. Instead, there were voices, low, cautious, but real. Laughter flickered for the first time in weeks. Children sat beside American boots, drawing stars, hearts, and animals. One girl handed a soldier a small cloth doll she had kept hidden since the war began. He accepted it with reverence, understanding the gesture without needing words. Tomoko, once an anonymous mother among many, became a quiet leader in the days that followed. She spoke not of politics or surrender, but of what she had seen. She told the story of a medic who ran into fire, not for glory or revenge, but to save a child. The villagers listened, not because they were told to, but because they needed to. And in their hearts a seed was planted, not of forgiveness perhaps, but of possibility. And for a place that had prepared only for death, that was the first step toward life. Years passed, and the war receded into the pages of history. But in Kadena, one memory refused to fade. The image of an American soldier cradling a Japanese child amidst rubble was passed from parent to child, not as legend, but as truth. It was not embellished or mythologized. It didn't need to be. Those who saw it never forgot, and those who heard it felt as if they had seen it themselves. Riku grew into a quiet man, shaped by the weight of what had happened to him as a boy. His leg always carried a slight limp, a reminder of the day the world changed. He never forgot the feeling of being lifted from the wreckage, of arms wrapped around him, of warmth through pain. When he was old enough, he chose to study medicine, not to repay a debt, but to honor the impulse that had once saved his life. In the pages of his notebook, he kept a single photograph, Sergeant Henley, sent years later by the soldier's family after learning the full story. Each year, on May 5th, the village held a quiet gathering at the site where the house once stood. It had long since been cleared, But in its place stood a simple stone marker. On its face were two inscriptions, one in Japanese, one in English. He gave his life so a child might live. No government had placed it there. The villagers had built it with their own hands. Despite shifts in politics and periods of rising nationalism, the stone was never touched. It was respected by all, even those who no longer remembered the war clearly. For Kadena, the monument was not about America or Japan. It was about one human moment, when fear and hatred were interrupted by sacrifice. It stood as a reminder of what people are capable of, in both destruction and grace. When American veterans returned to Okinawa decades later, they were often met with caution elsewhere. But in Kadena, they were welcomed. Some were invited into homes, served tea, shown family photos. And without fail, someone would mention the medic. The story was told with reverence, with emotion that never dulled. It had become sacred.
Tomoko lived into old age and never stopped speaking of that day. She didn't romanticize it. She didn't soften the terror she had felt. But she always ended her story the same way, with her hand pressed over her heart and a single sentence. "He did not see my son as the enemy." That was all she needed to say. The rest had already been carved into the hearts of those who listened.
Sergeant Henley never returned to Kadena. His injury had been too severe, and he died shortly after being evacuated. He was buried quietly, far from the place where his final act had taken place. His name never appeared in textbooks or on grand memorials. But in a village that once prepared to kill itself out of fear, his name was spoken with reverence every year. To the people of Kadena, Henley had become more than a soldier. He was a symbol of humanity defying indoctrination, of courage without recognition, of what it means to choose life even in a place shaped by death. And through that memory, generation after generation, they found a different way to live. In the end, the war did not define Kadena. The fear, the propaganda, the violence, they were part of its past. But the village remembered itself not through destruction, but through a single moment of compassion. A moment when a stranger crossed the line between enemy and savior. And in that moment, everything changed, forever.